welcome to our next module in our course. And here in this module, what we're going to be looking at is Catholic social teaching and how it relates to the issue of work. And now again, sort of like our previous module looking at the family, looking at work probably doesn't fit necessarily with what most of us think of when we think of Catholic social teaching, right? We tend to think again of those big controversial issues like immigration or solidarity with workers around the world or the environment, those sorts of things. But work is obviously a huge and important part of many people's lives. And it is something in which we are connected to big social institutions and where a lot of what many of us do for a significant amount of our waking lives is really tied up with the systems and decisions made in many cases outside of our control. And so it really is the sort of topic that Catholic social teaching is concerned with. And also, like the family, it's really one where it's going to affect many people in a very profound way, just because we spend so much of our working life engaged in work, whether it's in the office or in a factory or in a field or in a home. That work is going to constitute a lot of our lives, and therefore it's an important subject for us to be looking at. And we can run through many of the usual things that we do here in the module in terms of looking at the biblical basis, connections with natural law, and then talk about some of the high points raised in the compendium as we go along. But I really sort of wanted to start off this module reflecting a little bit on what kind of issues come up with work in connection with Catholic social teaching. Because many of us, when we think about work and faith, at least for me, right, we've probably all heard homilies about putting in a good day's work or being kind to others in the workplace as a way of sharing our faith. And of course, that's all good. And those are the kinds of things that often come up. And of course, people will say, oh, well, we wouldn't want to be involved in immoral work. But some of those issues we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. But there are also some issues that maybe we haven't really thought about in terms of being theological or being connected with our faith. So, for example, as I sit here talking to this camera in front of me, the university around me is actually pretty empty because the university is closed today. Right? This is a day off, and yet here I am talking to this camera. Talking to the camera basically because I just didn't have enough time during the regular week to get all of this done, given all the different responsibilities that I currently have, and so you have to do what you have to do. But at the same time, right, while I'm sitting here talking to this camera, the rest of my family is off somewhere else together, and I, in theory, could be with them. But unfortunately, the responsibilities of my job at the moment have me here. Right, and so one question we could ask is about this situation, right? Is this a situation that is in keeping with the understanding of the human person, what's good for the human person, and with Catholic social teaching? Because as we talked about last time, we need to think about the impact of actions on individuals, but also on families, right? And so when we think about work and work situations, we need to think about the balance between working life and the rest of life, most notably family life, right? Of course, you know, one of the reasons many of us take on additional responsibilities at work is in order to make more money, whether it's through hoping for a raise or promotion, or whether you negotiate a particular benefit in exchange for doing some extra task or responsibility. But again, that's why many of us end up in situations like the one I'm describing here. Well, what do we make of that, right? Ought we to be making decisions about how we use our time, how we balance family and work based on sort of those monetary decisions? So let's imagine, for example, that I stumbled across an ad for a position somewhere else, that would pay me significantly more and perhaps allow time to actually be home on the days off as opposed to talking to a camera? Would it be the right thing to take that job? Well, many of us would say yes, right? That would obviously be the right choice because in America we are really focused on career advancement, understood primarily in terms of compensation. That's really kind of our goal, right? Is that you go to where you can find the best paying job. Now, of course, we have to take into account cost of living and things like that, but that really is the primary criterion, I think, for many people. But again, to take my own case, right, part of why I'm here at Newman in the first place is that I grew up in Wichita, and I have family here, and I have parents who are getting older. In addition to that, my own family has put down roots and has made connections and relationships here in Wichita or in the Wichita area. So is it such a simple decision to say, oh, I should move to where I could get this higher paying job? There are lots of other factors that have to be considered, right? And one could also say maybe the highest paying job isn't even the best in terms of the benefits an employer provides, right? There might be another employer or a current employer that pays less, but in fact provides a work experience that's more in keeping with the Catholic understanding of the person. They provide a work experience that allows for greater flourishing of the individual because there are a whole host of things apart from a paycheck that shape how valuable a working experience is. And again, at the end of the day, the question is what is going to allow me as a human being to flourish, to fulfill God's plan for me. And a salary is going to be a necessary part of that for most of us. But there is, of course, more to life than that as well. And so these are complicated issues, right? And I think in a very real way, these principles of Catholic social teaching we're talking about, the things we're going to talk about in connection with work, are really directly relevant to the point of that they are really shaping the decision of me sitting here at this moment talking to this camera. And so those are the kinds of issues I want us to talk about, along with some of the bigger, more traditional aspects of Catholic social teaching. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So I think the first thing that we ought to do, as we've done on a number of modules so far, is to talk about the connections between Catholic social teaching and Scripture and natural law. So again, why do we take the time to look at Scripture and natural law in connection with these different issues we're looking at? Well, just again, to emphasize that Catholic social teaching is not some extraneous thing. It's not some extra or a modern import into the faith. That it is really just an expression of beliefs and principles that have been part of the Church since the beginning, and even prior to the Church are part of God's relationship with Israel. So again, I think it's worth taking a little time to note that, right? And we see that as well in the compendium. As each section begins, they will begin with talking about how the principles of Catholic social teaching being described there tie in both with Scripture and with a Catholic understanding of the human person. And so, again, I think it's important to emphasize this. And for those of you who might find yourselves teaching Catholic social teaching in various settings in a parish or in a school or wherever, or even if you're just going to be sharing it with friends and family, I think this is a very important point to emphasize because so many people have these political associations with Catholic social teaching, right? And so noting how it really is grows out of Scripture, tradition, the Catholic understanding of the person is really an important part of spelling out the Church's teaching. And when it comes to work in Scripture, of course, it is really literally, again, there from the beginning. Just as there's a family in the beginning, there is work in the beginning, right? That Adam and Eve are created and placed into the garden as stewards, right? That they are supposed to be caring for the world around them and doing work, right? Adam, of course, spends some time naming animals, but they're supposed to be basically tending a garden, right? And even when we get to the curse, right, which makes, of course, work much more difficult, less rewarding, less fulfilling, it's not as if work is the curse, right? as with childbearing, right? Childbearing would have happened whether there was a curse or not, but it becomes much more painful. And so too with work. Work was there from the beginning. It's a good part of God's creation. What sin does, what the fall does, is to make work much more difficult, right? So that he's going to have to toil by the sweat of his brow, whereas previous to that, presumably, work was a much more pleasant experience. And of course, we can only imagine what office work might have been like in an unfallen world. I can't even imagine. Maybe magically wonderful cubicles. It's not entirely clear, right? We can't really know what that would be like. But the key point here is that God creates human beings to do work, right? And they are supposed to participate basically in God's creation, right? That God puts them in the garden as the pinnacle of creation, but also that they are then to collaborate with God, right? They're to continue caring for what he created. And in fact, being made in God's image, they are called to be creative as well, right? To take what God has provided them and continue to create, continue to develop it into what it can be. So that is not something we do if we're interested in or do if we have to make a paycheck. It is part of how human beings were made to function, is to do some meaningful work that preserves the world around us or takes the world around us and adds something new, useful, beautiful to it. It's part of the understanding of the human person from Genesis 1 and 2. And of course, if we move forward into the Old Testament, we continue to see that, right? And now, of course, after Genesis 3, there's always this tension, this difficulty posed by sin and corruption. But the basic message is still there, right? So when we look in the law, we look at God's relationship with the patriarchs and with Israel, clearly work is understood to be part of life, and that if work is done well, done faithfully, then it is rewarded. And people who steal, or people who are dishonest, or people who aren't doing good work are going to suffer various kinds of punishments. When we get into the wisdom literature, right, of course there's a lot in wisdom literature about the importance of diligence and hard work and working wisely and prudently. And that over and over again, right, we're warned of the dangers of laziness, not just in terms of hunger and financial ruin, of course those are referenced, but even just the impact on the character of the person, right? That being a sluggard, being lazy, is not just potentially dangerous for you and your family. It is actually harmful to you as a person. It makes you a person less like what you were meant to be. And that's something that's certainly there in the wisdom literature, and that gets picked up and, of course, expanded in Scripture as it goes along, and Catholic social teaching and natural law after the New Testament. So as we again continue, we move into the New Testament. Where do we find work there? Well, again, it is really kind of pervasive. One really kind of significant reference to work, I suppose you could say, is really not mentioned much explicitly, but we can kind of piece it together, of course. If Jesus is about 30 years old when he begins his public ministry, what was he doing before that, right? Well, presumably, he is working as a carpenter. He is following Joseph into that business. And so Jesus would have spent the majority of his life working, doing daily skilled manual labor, almost certainly, right? So it would have begun at a relatively young age when he would begin learning the trade, and he would have certainly have been doing it as a regular job, a regular employment for quite a few years before launching into his relatively brief ministry of teaching and healing. And so Jesus models for us diligence and a life of work. And then when we get into the Gospels and the epistles, of course, we are encouraged to work. There's the famous passage in the Pauline epistles about whoever doesn't work shouldn't eat. Of course, not necessarily referring to those who can't work, but those who have the ability to do useful things and don't out of laziness are obviously condemned for that, right? And Paul, in a number of places, makes a point of how he tries to set an example for the people of a life of diligent work, right? That he could rely on their offerings to support himself, but instead he tends to work his trade traditionally as a tent maker, to support himself even while he's going on his missionary journeys, right? So again, from the beginning of the Bible through to the end, we see this emphasis on work. And really an important point for us in today's world is an emphasis on work not as drudgery, right? Not as something that we are forced to do because of financial necessity, but that work is a good, intended part of human life, and that a life without meaningful work is really missing something important, right? If you win the lottery and don't need the paycheck, I think you could draw very obviously from the biblical message that one still ought to work. One still ought to find a way to meaningfully contribute to being a steward of God's creation and working in the world around us to improve it and make it a better place for others as well. In addition to the kind of scriptural evidence for the importance of work, again, this is something that is taken up and developed in church teaching in the understanding of natural law, right? That it is in the context of work that we do a lot of the things that natural law says we ought to be doing, right? That for many of us, when we think about developing the virtues, right, given how much of our life is spent in work, that's going to be a place where we're going to be developing virtues, where we're going to be developing good relationships with others, right? When we think about the basic goods that make up a good, flourishing life according to natural law, good relationships with others, meaningful contribution to the community and to those around us. All of these things are going to be tied in with work, right? That it is going to, if work is just salary earning time, right, to kind of flip it into a negative, that's going to be a huge problem in terms of realizing the natural law view of what life ought to be, right, of promoting human flourishing. We can't really afford, in a natural law sense, to spend that much of our lives doing something that is not contributing to this overall development of the person, to this overall attainment of the different basic goods that make up a good life. So if it's just about a paycheck, that's going to be very problematic from the perspective of natural law. And so employees need to find a way to work that is going to allow them to do those other things, to develop relationships, to grow in their virtues, to develop their capacities and abilities in meaningful ways, right? And on the flip side to that, we'll get to this more a little later, employers ought to create environments where employees can do that, where they can do more than just earn a paycheck or contribute to the bottom line, where they can in fact develop and grow as persons and develop their natural capacities in new ways. So I don't want to belabor this point because we'll come back to some of these things later, but I think it should be obvious, right, that natural law is going to say that work is an important part of our life and needs to play an important part in our overall goal of fulfilling the nature that God gave us and becoming more and more in God's image, more and more the fulfilled person that God made us to be. Since we've been talking here about what an employer should provide an employee, in addition to a wage, maybe this is a good point to just go ahead and talk about the most obvious, I suppose, issues that come up in connection with Catholic social teaching and work, and that is precisely the rights of workers, right? That what ought workers to be able to expect when they enter into a relationship with an employer or a corporation. And so much of this might be fairly obvious to us, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but it is, I think, important to at least briefly note, right, some of these key principles raised in the compendium. So the first thing, of course, that comes to mind for pretty much everyone has to do with a wage. And again, this is something that is often in the news, where you hear about fights about raising minimum wages or different corporations deciding to raise their wages or not. Because at the end of the day, of course, the wage or the salary is a very crucial aspect to why people work, right? That we do need to support ourselves, we do need to support families, and not just provide enough food and shelter to keep us alive, but to provide enough material means to allow people to maintain human dignity and to ultimately flourish as individuals and as people. And so, obviously, Catholic social teaching emphasizes the need to provide a just wage. The workers have to be provided a just wage. Now, what does this mean? And of course, this is a very vexed issue and something that people debate a lot. In basic terms, right, what this means is that a worker who puts in a full day's work, right, which, what do we mean by a full day's work, right? We mean the amount of work somebody can be expected to perform while also being able to maintain a normal, dignified life, right? And so in our society, that probably means something like 8 hours or so. So that somebody who is putting in a day's work ought to receive a wage that will allow them and their family to live in at least basic human dignity. Now again, what does that mean, right? There's a lot of debate about how much money somebody needs in order to maintain human dignity or to be allowed to flourish, right? Does that mean that you have to be able to afford cable? Probably not. Does it mean you have to be able to have a little money beyond fulfilling your basic nutritional needs and simple shelter? Probably so. Now again, so it's going to be difficult to come up with a precise number, but the church says that we do need to provide a just wage to people, right? One that will allow them to live in dignity, and then we can talk about exactly what that means. Now, the one thing that we can be clear on, and that the compendium is clear on, is that this is not a legal issue, right? This is not a political issue, even though, of course, minimum wage, for example, gets brought into politics a great deal. The right of a worker to receive a wage that allows him and his family to live in dignity is not a political issue, right? It is a justice issue, that people are owed this on the basis of their human dignity, that they are to be treated as human beings, as persons, and not just as means of production, right? It's not just a walking forklift. It is a person who ought to be treated like another person, like one would want themselves to be treated, right? And so, for example, just because an employee agrees to work at a certain wage does not make that wage just, right? That people can, out of desperation or ignorance or a lack of other options, be forced to accept something that is in fact degrading to themselves as a person. So the fact that somebody has no other option and chooses to accept a job that pays them at a rate that is below the ability to maintain their dignity, that doesn't make that employment arrangement just. It doesn't make it fair. What is justice requires is a just wage, a wage that gives a worker who puts in a full day's work sufficient return to maintain dignity for himself and his family. Now, of course, when it comes to the real life, this can be very difficult, right? Many businesses would argue that they can't stay in business if they are required to do this, right? If they were required to pay all of their employees enough to support a family. We also have to take into consideration the fact that in our society, right, that part of the benefits or that one receives in exchange for work doesn't come directly from an employer, right? That there are payroll taxes which are then used to create all kinds of social benefits for people. And so it might be the case that you could have a just situation where when you take the combined return of the employer's paycheck along with the services provided by the government in a way via the taxes withheld from a paycheck, that then that still constitutes a just wage for the worker. And obviously this could be difficult to sort out, but the church's principles would remain the same while calling on us to do the hard work to really sort this out and to really ensure that people can receive a just wage and lead dignified lives, right? Because again, the ultimate principle behind all of this is that work and the economy is for the good of people and not the other way around, right? So our ultimate goal ought to be figuring out what is going to benefit people, and then figure out what are the economic arrangements that are going to make that possible. So this just wage is, of course, one of the most important factors when it comes to the rights of workers, but it is not the only one, right? That we have to take other things into consideration as well, right? So we've talked just a moment ago about social benefits, right? And so we need to make sure that we have arrangements in our society for caring for workers once they retire, or caring for workers who become injured and are unable to work, or to care for people who, for whatever reason, are unable to work themselves, right? That these benefits need to be worked out because we don't only respect people when they are putting in an economically productive 8 hours a day or more, that we need to arrange our society in such a way that we can support other people as well. And this, of course, is also going to include those who work in the home, who do a great deal of important work in society but don't receive a paycheck. So we need to make sure that there are ways of providing necessary social benefits to people who do that kind of work as well. Obviously, kind of going back to the more traditional job environment, we need to ensure workers' health and safety. And so as much as people might complain about things like OSHA and different government regulations, it is a requirement of Catholic social teaching that workers be provided with a safe and healthy working environment, right? And of course, if you think about Catholic social teaching getting its sort of formal start in the late 1800s, we've probably all heard stories about sort of factory conditions in the early industrial age, right, where you had sort of horrific accidents happening on a pretty regular basis because there were no regulations, right? There were no requirements about safety and machinery and chemicals. And so, again, what Catholic social teaching says, it does not dictate how these principles ought to be implemented and followed, whether it's through corporations creating policies, whether it's through government oversight, whether it's through some combination of those things. That's not specified. What is specified is that we do have to provide a safe and healthy working environment. And we also do need to recognize that in many cases corporations will not necessarily do what is best for workers on their own, right? History shows us that, and Scripture and natural law both point to the real danger of treating people as objects and not as people, and therefore we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, in addition to their basic physical health and well-being, you also need to provide for the spiritual, emotional health of employees, right? So we've probably all, anyone who's been in a work environment for very long, have encountered some kind of cheesy attempts to boost worker morale or what have you. And in many cases, those sorts of things are laughable. We all also probably recognize that there can be work environments that do support and affirm people's kind of spiritual and emotional well-being, and work environments that don't, right? And so it's not enough to simply not have exposed gears and machinery or sharp edges in your workplace. You also need to provide a workplace that is going to be healthy for the person as a whole and promote their spiritual and emotional well-being, right? A place where you are constantly verbally abused, for example, is not going to meet the requirements of a just work environment or a safe work environment. And then lastly, and again to kind of come to the example that started off our module today, we do have to allow workers, or employers have to allow workers, sufficient rest, right? Both in terms of the number of hours in a day that you're going to have workers working, but also time away for family, for friends, for relationship with God. right? And of course, this is most obviously the case in the Bible with the Sabbath, which we have translated into the modern world in our weekends. But of course, along with that, there would be other things as well, like a medical leave or bereavement leave or things like that, where we do need to allow employees time to take care of the other important parts of their lives, whether it's family, friends, community, that sort of thing. So at the end of the day, of course, right, we could sum all of this up to say that what we need to do is to create work and work environments that allow people to flourish, that we treat people as we ourselves would want to be treated, and we recognize them as human beings and as persons, and not just as employees, and not just as means to an end. Since we all know that, of course, in the real world, that workers aren't always provided a just wage or a good working environment, we have to talk, as the compendium does, about the relationship between labor and capital. Because again, Catholic social teaching really grows out of, at least the formal part of Catholic social teaching, out of industrialization in the late 18 and early 1900s. And of course, as we probably all know, kind of what happens historically as factories begin to grow and modern industry develops is that you do get quite a bit of conflict between labor and capital. And of course, one of the ways that conflict really gets crystallized is around unions and strikes. That the laborers form unions in order to create leverage to negotiate with capital to get increases in wages or changes in working conditions, right? And of course, thankfully, at least in this country, we don't have the same kind of issues that we saw in the early industrial age, although of course there are issues like that in many other parts of the world, and parts of the world that many of us are connected to via sort of global trade, and we can come back to that in a little bit. But even though we may not have those sorts of things here, there are of course still conflicts between labor and capital, between workers and business owners, and of course unions and strikes are still a part of that. And so for those of us, of course, in Wichita, we see this pretty regularly when the different airline workers unions, or not airlines, the aircraft manufacturers unions will go on strike. And you often see them out there every few years on the picket lines. And so what does Catholic social teaching have to say about this when we end up in these situations and it's not the case that we have agreement between owners and workers in terms of whether or not conditions are adequate or whether the wage is just? Well, as you can see for yourself when you look at the compendium, it's interesting that the compendium seems to come down fairly clearly on the side of labor. And so it emphasizes that the church affirms the right of workers to form unions. And so unions have been supported by Catholic social teaching really since its beginnings, again, in the age of Rerum Novarum in 1891. So unions are supported and affirmed as a valid way for workers, for laborers to advocate for a just wage and for just conditions. It is seen as sort of a necessary balance to the power of capital in sort of the modern economy. So again, for those of us who maybe are very comfortable with lots of other parts of Catholic teaching, for some this is going to be uncomfortable, but it is clear that it affirms the rights of unions, and even that it affirms the rights of unions to strike in order to attain the wages or conditions that are necessary. Now, we do want to, of course, note, as the compendium does, that this is not just sort of blanket approval for all union actions. The unions do need to be seeking what is in fact just and what is actually going to contribute to the common good. right? So this is not to say that capital or the owners have no rights, or that unions can demand whatever they want. But it is, I think, a reflection of something that we see throughout Scripture, throughout tradition, throughout social teaching, and I think natural law, right? Which is to say that the rich and powerful tend to have more power in these negotiations, and the benefits tend to gravitate in most situations to the rich and powerful. And it is typically those without the same amount of political or economic power who don't receive a just share. So I don't think it's terribly surprising that we find in Catholic social teaching this affirmation of unions and their right to strike in order to negotiate for a just wage or just conditions. And again, to get kind of in the more theoretical level here, when the compendium talks about labor and capital and how we distribute the benefits of economic activity, where do the profits for a business go? If you look at what the compendium has to say, this differs quite dramatically from what you would find sort of in the standard modern American business place, because it very clearly affirms the priority of labor over capital. And it says that labor ought to receive the first dibs, if you will, when it comes to the proceeds or the profits of a business enterprise. And of course, as we all know, right, this is not the way that most of the business world in America today works, right? That profits really go, in the vast majority of cases, to owners and to shareholders, and then employees can try to negotiate for higher wages, but that's really sort of a secondary issue, and that really the goal is return for shareholders. But this really doesn't fit if you look at what the compendium has to say in terms of how the proceeds from business enterprises ought to be distributed. It clearly says that labor has priority. And if you look at what the compendium has to say, perhaps even more provocatively, if you recall Mr. Beck's criticism of social justice being basically covert phrasing for the redistribution of wealth, which he equates with Marxism. So if you look, for example, at paragraph 303 in the compendium, it says at the end of the paragraph, their authentic economic well-being is pursued also by means of suitable social policies for the redistribution of income, which, taking general conditions into account, look at merit as well as at the need of each citizen. So in fact, I suppose on one level, Mr. Beck is being shown to be correct, right? That the compendium of the Church's Catholic social doctrine does in fact call for the redistribution of income. Now, you will note that it does not include the idea of forcible redistribution of income. It says that we need to come up with means of suitable social policies for the redistribution of income, which is, of course, an important distinction. This is a question of policy changes versus, socialist revolution. But at the end of the day, it does, in fact, call for a redistribution of income, given the fact that our current work arrangements, instead of emphasizing labor, in fact, our current situation really is slanted in favor of capital and the owners, which differs dramatically from what the compendium would say should be the case. To shift a little gears just a bit here on this topic, to look at it a different way, one of the things that is a big issue in the current economy is the idea of employment and full employment, and prioritizing employment over profits and dividends. So another way of emphasizing this priority of labor is to say that if we have a choice between maximizing shareholder dividends and maximizing employment, we ought to do the latter, right? So in other words, if our choice is to downsize our workforce and manage to get a higher profit from that, or maintain the current workforce, which is going to require a lower degree of profit, The compendium would say we ought to do the latter, that we ought to organize our businesses and organize our economy in a way that maximizes employment rather than profit. So again, this is something that is fairly dramatically at odds with current American business practice. But the idea is that it is aimed at the well-being of people, and in particular, the well-being of those without power, without capital, who rely on a daily wage to support themselves and their family. Because as we've all seen fairly dramatically in recent years, that it is very easy in our economy to decrease the number of employees and increase a company's profits. When we have record highs in Wall Street, but many people have not ever received the jobs back that were lost during the last financial crisis. So I think that's a kind of negative portrayal of what is being advocated here in the compendium. And so as you can see, there are going to be a number of things in the compendium about the relationship between labor and capital that will be uncomfortable for many Catholics, but at the end of the day, it is still there and is still an expression of this idea of promoting the human dignity of every person. So again, the conflict between labor and capital, while complicated and while certainly controversial still today, is kind of what many of us would probably think of when it comes to Catholic social teaching as it relates to work, right? So if we were going to say, well, yes, maybe it does relate to work, we would probably gravitate towards that sort of issue, this fight between owners and unions and that sort of thing. And of course, as you can see for yourselves, the compendium talks about that a great deal. But I think one of the interesting things about the compendium and why I think it's worth using is that it brings up another number of other issues that we might not really think about in terms of being theological issues or Catholic issues when it comes to the nature of modern work, right? It's not just about a living wage, although that is an important part of the Catholic teaching on work and workers. As we talked about before, right, that part of what needs to be provided for workers is not just a paycheck, but is also an opportunity for them to develop and flourish as human beings. And the compendium, in the later parts of this section, focuses on some aspects of modern working life that raise challenges in that regard, right? So for one thing that's noted in the compendium is sort of the modular nature of a lot of modern work, right? That in the drive to maximize efficiency, to maximize profit, that the processes in many businesses have been broken into these very small modular components, right? That we can see this most obviously in a factory, right? Where an individual worker may be assigned to only one particular task, right? Riveting one particular part or assembling one particular wiring assembly. And they do this over and over and over again, which is very efficient, but again, as I think we all understand, right, is certainly not beneficial for the overall emotional and intellectual and spiritual well-being of a worker, right? Very different than, say, in a pre-modern environment where a worker might create an entire piece of furniture or create an entire tool, right? The modern worker is often only performing one specific part of that task over and over and over again. But of course, the same thing happens in white-collar business as well, right? That we don't have a bookkeeper in the sort of classical Victorian sense, right? Somebody who would be managing all kinds of business affairs, right? We have people who process invoices in an accounts receivable department. And so basically all they do all day long is use the same three screens to enter invoices. So even though it's not, say, riveting on an assembly line, it's a similar sort of thing, right? That the work of the finance of a business has been broken into these very small parts, which again might be quite efficient, but has real consequences in terms of the impact on the worker, right? Because part of how work ought to be biblically and according to natural law is that one finds fulfillment in work, right? That there's this sense of satisfaction, this sense of accomplishment at a job well done, right? When somebody can stand back and look at something and take pride in their work, right? And that is something that the compendium argues is lost by a lot of these modern working arrangements, that you don't get that same sense of accomplishment and pride in these sorts of modular work environments. Kind of partnering with that, right, is also a loss of participation, right? We talked about participation in a previous module, this ability of people to have a say in the decisions that shape their lives. In a lot of modern working environments, this is not the case, right? That the person working in accounts payable or receivable, or the person on the manufacturing line, does not have a say in how to perform their job. And in fact, they're given very specific instructions on precisely how to perform their job. And any deviation from that is going to be have consequences. And so that ability to innovate, that ability to vary things, to find what works for you individually, again, at least in many situations, is taken away by the modern work environment. And so I think that might not come to our minds immediately when we think about Catholic social teaching and issues related to work, but as the compendium notes, given kind of the overall understanding of the human person that Catholic social teaching is based on, these are in fact real issues, right? And we aren't necessarily providing just employment just by providing a living wage, right? That we really need to aim at the overall good of employees, which is going to involve giving them some sense of fulfillment, giving them an opportunity to develop their abilities and to have a say in the way they live their working lives. This could even, again, extend to things like the environment. I remember a movie from when I was growing up, Joe versus the Volcano, with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, one of the presumably dozens of movies they made, all variations on the same romantic comedy theme. But in Joe versus the Volcano, you, I think, get a very kind of over-the-top depiction of a negative working environment, right? So that if you're putting people in a place where the environment is drab and depressing and the lights are blinding and the screens are flickering, again, while it may not be, the exposed gears of a machine that's going to suck a worker in and take off their arm, it still is something that is going to prevent that person from flourishing, prevent that person from really living a fulfilled life, right? Because no one wants to work in a depressing, deadening environment day after day. But of course, in fact, we often find that to be the case. Now again, those are, I think, some issues that might surprise a lot of us when it comes to Catholic social teaching. There are others that we haven't touched on specifically yet that are less of a surprise, right? So globalization is something that comes up in the compendium in relationship to work. And part of this has to do with recognizing the role that we play as consumers or as investors or even as employers in the way that workers are treated in other countries, in other parts of the world. And of course, in many parts of the world, some of the issues that were going on in the early industrial age are still happening today, as we've already talked about. What I guess differs a little bit with globalization is that sort of the scale of these systems makes it difficult for many of us to have any sense of what's going on with the companies we interact with, right? That in the old world, if you went to a cobbler shop and you saw the old cobbler kind of abusing the apprentices in the back, you would know that, right? And you could do something about it as a customer. But of course, kind of famously with Nike, if they have sweatshops in Bangladesh, that's something that most of us aren't aware of. And so this is going to be very problematic, and it allows Nike to operate that way, whereas they wouldn't be able to if their customers were seeing it sort of firsthand. But also, perhaps again a little closer to home, for example, for those of us in the Wichita area, globalization is another thing that sort of shifts the favor towards capital over labor, right? And the ability in the modern world to, when faced with a union, faced with the threat of strike, to just move elsewhere, more or less at the drop of the hat. So if employees in Wichita are giving you a hard time, you just move to another state, or in fact, perhaps more dramatically, just move to another country. Because with globalization, you can make your wings anywhere. You can make your airplane parts anywhere, and just ship them to a final assembly point. And again, globalization, while it seems to increase efficiency, it increases profits in many companies, but it further skews the odds, if you will, in favor of capital over labor, which again is part of why Catholic social teaching calls for the rights and priority of labor. And that's just one specific kind of often focused on aspect of the dynamic nature of the modern working world, right? That we have created a world where the idea that somebody takes a job at a corporation when they're young, when they come out of college, and then works there for 40 years and retires and gets a gold watch. Of course, we all know that those days are long behind us, at least in the vast majority of cases. And the basic understanding seems to be that the more dynamic approach to modern employment is beneficial, right? It creates higher profits, it's more efficient. And those things may very well be true, but we also need to recognize that they do also create problems when it comes to the rights of workers and workers' ability to grow and flourish. That those dynamic employment arrangements where employees will change jobs frequently in an attempt to climb the corporate ladder, or where employers feel no particular responsibility for their workers. No, they just will hire and fire and downsize and upsize at the dictate of the market. All of this undercuts meaningful relationships, right? And this is not good for persons, right? That people need meaningful relationships to flourish. And even for those who are real defenders of economic efficiency, many don't seem to recognize the fact that it is that lack of enduring relationships that drives a lot of the need for regulations and for laws, right? That if employees and employers are in stable long-term relationships, we don't probably need the government dictating the minutia of leave policies or working environments, because that long-term relationship will make those things happen naturally. But if one's workforce is constantly coming and going, then it seems plausible to me that you're going to need regulations, you're going to need the government to enforce those things, since there is no relationship there for it to happen naturally. So again, that would be something we could talk about further in the discussion, but it's just one other thing noted in the compendium, that this dynamic mobile workforce does create economic opportunities, but it does create new modern problems when it comes to the just treatment of workers. Now, of course, there's a lot more that we could talk about, but that really sort of captures the main things that stood out for me in my reading of the compendium. And while I could certainly highlight, and I guess I have highlighted some key things that I think might very well be worth discussing, but rather than specifying a few particular cases like I did in the module on the family, I think there's probably enough here that's going to stand out to all of you just from what's been discussed and what you'll come across in your own reading. So I will look to see on the discussion board what questions you all have from this part of the compendium. For me, really, it sort of boils down to some very pragmatic questions about how do we try to live this out in the modern world that we live in today, right? That it seems to me the real difficulty lies in if we have companies and owners who really are trying to do the things outlined here in the compendium, right, to really promote the well-being of their employees over the bottom line, how do those employers remain competitive and viable in a marketplace where many other companies are not doing that, and therefore can have lower prices and higher profit margins. And at the end of the day, I think, from my perspective, that would be sort of the real challenge. But I would be interested, as I said, in hearing the things that stand out to you in your own reading of this and in your own thinking about the issues discussed in the module. So I will look to see that on Blackboard, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you.